Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachigian, and today I'm joined by Daniel Bove. After receiving a Bachelor's of Science in Kinesiology from Penn State University and a Master's of Science in Exercise Science from the University of South Florida, Daniel began his career as an NBA physical preparation coach. After spending several seasons with the Atlanta Hawks and Phoenix Suns, Daniel is now the Director of Performance and Sports Science for the New Orleans Pelicans. I've always respected Daniel's ability to consolidate data and math-heavy sports science concepts into simple heuristics or rules of thumb. Daniel has a unique ability to simplify the complex without watering anything down. Daniel and I discussed the philosophical underpinnings of his program, different ways of looking at concepts like injury prevention and transfer, consolidating strength and conditioning stressors with sport practice and competition, and Daniel's new book, The Quadrant System. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on. There's a lot of interesting things in your background we could talk about, but just in the interest of time, I want to begin by listening to your background as far as I think you were a CrossFit coach at one point, and then you transitioned into the NBA. So can you talk a little bit about that transition, that journey? And I'm also interested to hear your thoughts on what it was like as a CrossFit coach and how that maybe influenced some of your thinking now, because I think in our field it's very trendy to bash CrossFit, but I think that there's a lot that we can learn from it, and probably working in the NBA now, which, it's a kind of a mixed qualities type sport. I would guess that there's a lot of things like from a programming standpoint that CrossFit help prepare you for.
Yeah, no, for sure. First of all, Doug, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate you bringing me on this podcast. I'm a big fan. Yeah, to answer your question, I started out my career as a CrossFit coach, but it kind of started. The road that led me there was I went to Penn State for undergrad, and I actually came into school as an architectural engineering major, and with a background in a little bit of fine art. And I kind of realized, like, you know what, I don't want to take 3 or 4 calculus classes. So I moved on to fine art as my major. And actually at the time I was with the club wrestling team at Penn State, and I was obsessed with training and the body. And I was like, how can I, merge, fine art and what I like to do from like a hobby standpoint with training. So medical illustration was what I actually wanted to go into. And then as I kind of went down that rabbit hole, I became more and more obsessed with the physiology and the anatomy and the actual science of exercise. So I made the full transition to kinesiology. And when I had to do my internship for my program, I interned at a local CrossFit gym called CrossFit Lionheart in State College, Pennsylvania. And I was hooked immediately. I wanted to be not only a coach, but I wanted to be a competitive CrossFit athlete. And the interesting thing about, that, I think the interesting thing about the sport of CrossFit is you have to kind of become like a master of none, but like you have to know a little bit, a little bit about everything, right? You need to know your energy systems. You need to know about your anatomy. You need to know about, technique, but not only just technique with lifting, or running, but like gymnastics technique, like these, so many different movement patterns you have to become sort of an expert on. So, uh, I loved learning all those different facets. And when I left Penn State, I got hired as a full-time CrossFit coach in Philadelphia at CrossFit Center City. I worked there for a few years, and that's actually where I met my wife. But as I started to grow as a coach, I realized that there was still a piece of me that wanted to really further my knowledge in the actual science and the physiology. And I wanted to learn a little bit more about how to read and interpret research, how the scientific method is really performed. And I went to University of South Florida to get my master's. So I left CrossFit, went to grad school, spent a couple years there where I fell in love with the science aspect, but then also like, the sports science aspect of like workload management and, training responses, things like HRV. I started to really get into that and was like, you know what, I would love to blend this sports science approach with strength and conditioning. And, one thing led to another. And when I got out of school, I was lucky enough to get my foot in the door with the Atlanta Hawks and worked with some amazing people there, and really got a chance to grow. And that led me to, I went to the Suns, and now I'm with the New Orleans Pelicans in this current role. To answer the second part of the question, uh, about what CrossFit, some things you can take away from that and how it applies to what I currently do. I think I mentioned it earlier, but CrossFit, it makes you have to know a little bit about a lot of things, but mainly how I think different stressors kind of match. And I think that's part of, I think, what led to the way my book was framed, which I know we'll talk about in a little bit. The way that I would say what inspired some of the book was actually being a CrossFit coach and having to blend, monostructural endurance training with gymnastics work, with Olympic weightlifting, with powerlifting, with running, with rowing, all these different modalities, which don't traditionally match. And, concurrent training is tough to periodize and it's tough to plan, but CrossFit, it forces you to do that. If you're going to coach it really well, you have to be able to look at the lay of the land and pair properly, but then also not even just pair things properly, but like from session to session, you're trying to get your athlete to be good at everywhere. So it's the most challenging. It's probably the most challenging sport I've ever worked with because of all of the chaos that is involved in it. It's very unpredictable. So these CrossFit Games athletes, they don't know what the events are always going to be. They show up and they know in the moment. So
Yeah, and it's just kind of this whole thing where it's like you've got to be sort of prepared for anything, but then if you prepare for everything, you're prepared for nothing. But I think people associate CrossFit with like the workout of the day at some random box's website. But if you look at like what the high level CrossFit competitors are doing, like it is very, very intricate programming. It's almost like MMA, right? Like how do you develop your ground game, your striking game, your strength and conditioning, and do that in a way where it's compatible and your training in one area is not interfering with something else. I think that like if you can program for high level CrossFit, or you can program well for some of these workouts that look, or these wads that look like they're kind of like just pulled out of thin air. But if you're systematic as to how you prepare for those seemingly random workouts, I think you can take a lot from that and apply that into sport. And that's kind of like what you've done. And I think another thing that's cool that you've done is when I read some of your work, I can see some of the influences from outside the field. And there's a lot of philosophy in there. Even, we'll talk about your sports science background in a little bit, but I know that you have the sports science position and background, but I think you've done a really good job of taking these sports science concepts that oftentimes can be very like quantitative and absolute and sort of like optimal, but you just create kind of like your book, these almost like heuristics and just simple rules of thumb to just take all that stuff and not necessarily not water it down, but make it where it's very digestible. So what are some of your influences outside the field that have kind of just shaped like how you look at training and how you created your own system?
yeah, so the first I'll comment on the heuristics that you're talking about. I when I make those when I've made those tweets and those posts on social media, a lot of times it always comes from a place of I'm usually making notes, whether it's in my notebook or my phone, like whatever. Like I try to, if I can take a really complex idea and you know simplify it, it usually means I better understand it, right? Like um, I think people who can take really complex things and make them simple, you're usually the ones who understand and can teach it really well. And I'm not saying that's what I am, but that's what I strive to do with these tweets. And whether it's looking at like jump performance or small sided games or like energy systems, whatever. Like it's really just it's for me to try to better understand the material that I'm trying to teach, but then also use in my environment. So there's those tweets are as much about my own satisfaction as they are about like teaching, like or putting it out there for clicks, right, and likes and retweets. So uh, I'm just sharing my process with people. To go back to my inspirations, like I know you and I, we kind of connected a couple years ago over, we really enjoyed some of Nassim Taleb's work, and, um, a lot of his heuristics, I think, have bled into mine, and how I feel about everything. Naval Ravikant, another, I think, really clear thinker who I love the way he consolidates his thoughts and puts them in and his tweet storms online. I think we also connected over some of that too. The way he thinks about things, I really value that. A lot of the VC, the Silicon Valley people, they're lateral thinkers. They try to think outside the box. I really respect people like Keith Raboy, Peter Thiel, those type of people. I think they have some really good wisdom, and there's a lot of good stuff that they've put out. So those are some people that I draw inspiration from.
Yeah, I just appreciate your ability to kind of like zoom in and zoom out, and sometimes you're able to zoom in better because you have this broader perspective. And that now, as far as like the zooming in, how did you, or at what point in your career did you actually learn the data science stuff? And this is a question I love to ask people like you: is for someone who's maybe more of a coach and not a sports scientist, or maybe someone who's a coach but doesn't have access to a sports science but might want to implement some sports science with their athletes, how much do you think people need to know of that to be like a good applied practitioner and not just look at it from like an academic lens?
That's a great question. So a little bit about my background. When I got out of graduate school, I went to graduate school with the thought, like, I wanted to learn more about the physiology and obviously like the research process. And I did, I got that. But um, I also wanted to get to a point where I could work with the elite athletes in a team sport environment. And I knew, so basically I had two goals: to work with a team sport at a high level, like at a pro level, but then also, I wanted to learn, I've always wanted to learn the Excel and the coding side, which would allow me to monitor the workloads of the athletes I was coaching, or monitor their performance or their response to training using things like HRV. And I was really interested in um, piecing it all together. And I never had that skill set. I never was forced to learn Excel or R or Python, any of those things. And when I got out of grad school, you know how saturated this market is in strength and conditioning and sports science. Um, I couldn't get an internship anywhere. Like, I literally couldn't get my foot in the door anywhere. And I actually went back to working for a CrossFit gym in Philadelphia.
Hmm.
And my wife and I got married in May, and a few years back. And I graduated grad school, got married, and I was immediately working in CrossFit again. So I felt like I went backwards. Not because there's anything wrong working in CrossFit, but just because that was what I was doing before I went to grad school. And I was like,
Sure.
wait, I'm just back where I was. Like, why did I even go to grad school? Like, if I wasn't going to, like, move into a different direction. So I was working full days, but I had basically from, like, I'd say like 11 a.m. to like 4 in the afternoon every day was just an open period for me, where I was in the city just hanging out at the CrossFit gym I was working at. So, and I was working like 7 days a week. So I was like, why don't I use this time to really just dive in and learn some of the data science and the sports science stuff. So John Leith, who runs Excel Tricks for Sports, he has an amazing YouTube page that I think not enough people know about. He has so many videos that break down how you can, start your own basically athlete management system through an Excel file. So I started in video one, and I watched about like 100 of his videos,
Wow.
and I practiced. I literally just made stuff for my CrossFit athletes in Excel for, I'd say, a 3, 4, 5 month period. I just like went at it every single day and learned a little bit of R. But YouTube basically is what gave me the skill set. People don't realize like how much they can learn on YouTube. So if you want to learn a skill, just either Google or YouTube it, and you will be able to find out how to do it. You just got to put the hours in, and that's exactly what I did. And one thing led to another, and the Atlanta Hawks, they had a job opening. It was going to be a dual sports science strength and conditioning role, which is exactly what I wanted. And Andrew Hauser, who's with the Atlanta Braves at the time, now with the Dodgers, he put me in touch with the Hawks. They asked for my portfolio. I sent them a bunch of the stuff I was doing on the CrossFit side
Wow.
with data, and I showed them, like, this is what I'm doing with my CrossFit athletes from a workload management standpoint. This is what we're doing. Here's how we're tracking things. Here's how we're looking at athlete responses and subjective scores with like wellness and all that. And they hired me on. They let me join their staff, and I worked with a phenomenal staff there. We had, Art Horn, Mike Ron Karate, Chris Chase, Zach Markowitz. We had amazing people there. So I got to really learn from them. And I'm going off on a tangent now, but from the
No,
skill
that's
set.
really interesting stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, the skill set that you're talking about, it was really just like, it was, I just YouTube.
No, that's great because it just goes to show that like you don't know what's going to be your breakthrough. And most people like that's not necessarily the career path most NBA performance directors, strength coaches take, where it's like they were in CrossFit, but you were in CrossFit, and then from there, like you taught yourself how to do all the sports science and the data science stuff. People romanticize YouTube as like it's this free alternative to formal education, but a lot of people don't actually take advantage of it. You did, and then you applied what you were learning on YouTube, into your CrossFit practice, and like that was essentially your resume that got you an NBA job. So you just never know what's gonna lead to that breakthrough. So I think that's really cool, and it's a good lesson to people that like you don't necessarily, there isn't always a fixed career path to get to some of the places like where you ended up. And then to kind of piggyback on that, how much of the data science stuff do you think that people like if they want to be an NBA strength coach, let's say, or just be a strength coach that wants to be more data informed, how deep do you have to get to be a good applied practitioner where you could, you're still going to coach and work with athletes, but you want to kind of audit yourself through data, not just be a pure researcher, let's say.
No, I think that's a phenomenal question. And I think it's a skill set that I don't think enough coaches, strength coaches are really trying to like improve. I think if I had to give a couple recommendations, I think the number one would be just how to create a database in Excel. Like how do you store your data? Because like if it's stored properly and you know how to make a table, then like that's the biggest battle, is just having everything in one place and not scattered all over, right? So it's like, I think really knowing how to set up a database in Excel, and then knowing how to query for what you want. Like what's the question you're asking, and like can you easily identify like where the data is and how to filter it and how to go in and search for something. Like I think if strength coaches just knew how to do that, then that's like 90% of what you need from a data perspective.
Right.
I mean, pivot tables are extremely easy to create. Like, and they allow you to really just query for information. Like I think, and that would take, you spend an hour, you would learn all those things very quickly. And I think not enough people are doing some simple stuff like that. So that would, my number one thing would be know how to create a database and know how to query it.
Yeah, I think what deters a lot of people is they think that like they're coaches and they say, well, I don't have time or the desire to get a PhD in data science. But if you still want to coach, you don't need to get to that level. Like if you want to be just purely do research in sports science and not coach, then you might have to get a PhD. But I think that's kind of maybe one of the mischaracterizations of it. Like you learned on YouTube, like there's ways to acquire this knowledge without having to like totally do a 180 in your career and invest, like 5 to 6 years in getting a PhD. So I think that really clarifies a lot, and kind of muddles through some of the confusion when it comes to the data science, because it's easy to say like, well, I've got to spend all this time, so I'm just not going to do it. But you made obviously an investment in it, but it was an investment that you could make while you were still coaching. And it didn't set you back in your coaching endeavors either.
Yeah, and it was always, I will say this, whenever you're learning a skill, whether it's when you're coding or doing an Excel, template, whatever it is, it's always so much better. It sticks so much easier as a skill when you're doing it for a specific problem or that you're trying to solve, or when you're looking for a specific solution, whether like, for instance, if you're trying to really up the way that you're monitoring VBT or, or workload, and you're going into it, like wanting to learn the skills so that you can do that, then like, it's just going to stick that much better. And it's going to be an actual tool that you add to your toolkit, rather than like, I think I did it I think when I first started out, I did it the hard way, because I just basically started, I was like, okay, Excel tricks for sports YouTube page. I'm starting video 1 and I'm just going to go all the way through.
Right.
instead of going into it thinking like, okay, this is what I'm looking to do, and then going and searching for the video that taught me how to do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah, so you're saying like you didn't originally know what you wanted, like what particular part of sports science was going to benefit your coaching practice. So you just kind of drank from the fire hose.
yeah.
So you think you could be a little bit more strategic about it. But again, I think that it's hard to retroactively, look back and say, well, here's what I should have focused on, because until you have more, I think until you have a broader exposure to the data science, you don't know what's actually important to your coaching practice. So I mean, whatever, it all worked out in the end anyway.
Yeah. No,
But
100%. If anything, like it taught me a lot, and I'm happy I did it. I mean, I wouldn't be where I'm at today if I didn't.
yeah, and I want to talk about a couple of Bove heuristics, Bovisms, because I think that those are going to segue nicely into some of the other things that we want to talk about in leading up to your book. And I would encourage anyone, and I'll put the link to this, to check out your Twitter page, because before you wrote your book, actually, I know we've been trying to organize this for a while. I actually wanted to do a podcast where like I just read a bunch of your tweets and have you elaborate on it, because I find them very thought provoking. But it's kind of like a good movie where it leaves you wanting a little bit more, and it's like, where's the sequel? And the sequel is going to be this. But so one of them that I really liked was, at the edges of performance, dysfunction can be highly functional. So can you elaborate on that one to begin?
Yeah, I think this one applies to not just sport. This applies to any aspect of life or any field. Anyone who's a high performer, no matter what it is, they're usually unbalanced. And in order for them to be extremely good in one area, they have to give up other areas. And you know, you look at look at any artist throughout time. Look at any real like high level thinker. They were always just there was just something off with them. Whether it's Edgar Allan Poe or like Salvador Dali, like just all these different people. If you start talking about it from a performance standpoint, I mean, I could talk about basketball. You look at just the way that some athletes and their feet, like the way that their feet actually change over time, and
Hmm.
some of the best change of direction athletes I've ever seen in basketball have completely flat feet, and that they're stuck in pronation. They're stuck in the basement, right? And what that it allows them to hit angles and find specific degrees of operating and ways to push off and go certain ways. Like their foot has adapted to their sport. It might not be the best for other things, but it's really good for them moving on the floor. The same with you look at a power lifter who's it's very sagittal and it's very extension based, uh, what they're doing. Look at their extensor tone in their lower back, and try to get them to posteriorly yield and really like absorb as they're going into like a cut or a change direction. It's not going to look great. um, but they're going to lift the hell out of that weight because they've basically limited degrees of freedom to be able to lift really, really heavy weight. But it's not like they're going to go out and be a great endurance athlete either. It's like they've specialized, right? So it's like they are dysfunctional. If you put a powerlifter in certain scenarios, he might appear dysfunctional, but he's extremely functional for powerlifting. So that's I think that's where that came from. You know, anything done at a really high level is going to create imbalances, and that's what I was trying to convey in that tweet.
Yeah, and then I think it becomes a matter of semantics, because if it's truly adaptive and it helps performance, well, then it's not dysfunctional. It's context specific, but it's not
Yeah.
dysfunctional for that particular endeavor. It might be dysfunctional in another context. But one thing that's really, and I know, like with some of the reading that you've done, the people you referenced, you talk a lot about like mental models and ways of thinking and looking at the world and looking at reality. And I think as like whether as physios or as strength coaches or as sports scientists, we have these models and these norms that like that's our lens through which we look at movement, look at people. And like I know for my like I haven't worked with as many high level basketball players as you, obviously, but the ones that I have, like not a single one of them actually had what you would consider like normal dorsiflexion in the angle in the ankle. But they're playing in the NBA or playing Division I basketball. But then again, I think sometimes like it does matter. Like I think it can be bad if you have no dorsiflexion. It's just hard to know when it matters and when it doesn't, and when it's adaptive and when it's pathological. Because I think that with these really elite athletes, they tightrope this line between like, you know, what we consider pathology and adaptation,
Mm.
and they're just riding that line, and the ones that are like stay healthy are manage to stay on one side of that line, but then the people who are like really high performers that are hurt a lot, they're on the other side of that line. So how do you in your world kind of reconcile that and figure out like when something actually matters and needs to be changed and when it deviates too much from your kind of model of movement and when it's adapted and we shouldn't mess with it? I know that's a really hard question and probably something that none of us can definitively answer, but I know that you're trying to navigate that all the time.
That is such a good question, and that's definitely a hard question to answer. It reminds me of like, so I don't know if you're familiar with James Fitzgerald, but he is James Fitzgerald was the first person to win the CrossFit Games back
Okay.
in, it was like '07 maybe. It was a while ago. And he actually branched off and he created a company called OPEX. And OPEX, it's his own education platform for CrossFit coaches or fitness coaches. And it's probably the best, I would say it's the best I think continuing education platform that you can find within the sport of CrossFit. And he works with a ton of high end CrossFit Games athletes, and he looks at their blood work throughout the course of a year. And these are the fittest people in the world. I mean, we're talking people who can run 5-minute miles, deadlift 500 pounds, snatch 300, clean and jerk 350, like have insane gymnastics ability. But if you look at their blood work, they have the blood work of like 80-year-old men, or
Really?
like they have blood work that would more so resemble someone who's closer to sickness than health.
Hmm.
If you look at like the sickness and health continuum, like they're closer to sickness than they are to something that looks good. So, but they're really, really good at doing what they're doing. Now, how long will that last?
Right.
I don't know. And I think we wonder about that too in the NBA. And I think to a certain point, you're trying to maximize their potential within their athletic prime as much as you can, while also preserving them. And at the end of the day, we can talk performance until we're blue in the face, but a lot of our job at the NBA level is keeping people healthy and keeping them on the floor, because I mean they're getting paid a lot of money, and we have to protect those assets. So um, we're always riding the fence between letting them be themselves, and you know like we talked about with the feet, like they develop these patterns for a reason, and like how much can we override, or how much do we want to override? You're always asking those questions on like what you can and can't control, and then trying to make the best decision going forward. I don't know if that answered your question, or if that was just kind of like a
No,
roundabout.
it does. And it's also like, how much of it can we actually change, right? Like if someone's literally been, I mean, these people before they get to the NBA are playing basketball like year round, every day, playing pickup, organized ball. And like if their ankles and their feet have adapted in that way, like if we have them do, stand a couple of inches away from the wall with their foot down and have them try to get their knee to hit the wall, like how much are we really going to change their ankle mobility, So that's another thing too, is like even if we identify it as a quote unquote problem, assuming that's even correct, like can we change it and which rabbits do we chase, right? And it's just, I know that, I mean, that could be a whole like podcast in itself of, I don't want to say that like we should be nihilists and say that, like everything an athlete does and how they self-organize is good, because then we would be out of jobs, right? Like I think we have to have a critical eye, and that's what differentiates the good coaches from the not so good ones, is like, when to intervene.
100.
But it's,
Yeah.
yeah, it's tricky. And I think your answer was, it's thought provoking. I mean, again, we can go on about that, but another really, really cool Bovism, and this kind of ties into the transfer of training concept that I want to talk about in a little bit, is you said for capacity, train below competition speed; for precision, train at competition speed; for power and potentiation, train above competition speed; adjust volumes accordingly. So that's programming, like in a nutshell right there. Um,
Again, yeah, that was just me trying to understand the process and making that tweet. I was trying to simplify it for myself. The way that I think about it is like when I was working with CrossFitters. Let's take rowing for example. If you find out that you're a really weak rower, and maybe you need to increase your aerobic power on a concept too, the number one, the gold standard assessment on a rower is the 2K, like a 2K time trial. That tends to be like, that's like the mile in like track and field, right? Like everyone wants to know like how fast what's your mile time, or like how much do you bench? Well, like for rowers, it's like what's your 2K. Um, when you're training for a 2K and like that's your event, and I know that a lot of your audience probably already knows this, but like, or very early on, capacity and like workload, or accumulating workload is really what most of the program is about, at least in endurance sports. So, if whatever your 2K test time is, whatever that pace is, that's your race pace. And then you tend to accumulate volume underneath that. Well, I guess slower than that. So time wise, it'd be above. So if you have a 7 minute 2K, you're probably doing a ton of capacity work at like a 7:30 pace, 7:30 to 7:40 pace, right? So you're doing a lot of your training in that accumulation. So you're training basically below the speed of competition. Uh, moving forward, as it becomes a little bit more intense, you go to race pace. You start accumulating volumes there, until you're actually about to be in competition, and you start hitting things that are a little bit faster, right? And accumulating some of that like glycolytic range, a little bit more um, high intensity effort. So I look at it the same way that I look at rowing when I'm looking at training for a team sport, and you take the speed of competition. So when you look at things like basketball, you're talking 5-on-5. So like the outputs that they're hitting on a 5-on-5 full court session, that is game speed. And, we're able to measure these things with LPS systems and accelerometers. So we know exactly what's happening on the court. And then you just, you try to replicate that at different times of the year, and you do it the exact same way. By when you're building capacity, you find ways to maybe increase the volume, but keep the intensity a little bit under what they hit in game. And then, when you're really trying to potentiate and get the guys really working above game speed, then there's ways you can adjust the drills accordingly, or the small sided games that you're trying to implement. So I look at it as like, it's like when you're as a cyclist, use the power meter to really know like what watts you're hitting and how you're training. And it's like, find your team sport power meter by going above or below the sport speed. So that's kind of what that tweet was about.
Yeah, I love that because it reminded me, we talk about like things that survive, things that are Lindy, and it
Mhm.
reminded me of kind of the track and field model where no matter what lens you look at track and field, whether it's through like more of the like the VO2 max, like physiological type lens, where you look at it more in terms of like the event, maximal aerobic speed. We have different ways of describing the same thing, but like if you want to run a good 800-meter time, historically, what successful coaches have done is they've worked on the extremes and then met in the middle. So like you have to be fast enough, right? Like if you want to run, say, like a sub, 2-minute 800, if you can't run a 15-second 100, then like, or I would say even well below that, like a 13 or even a 12-second 100, you're not going to run the 2-minute 800. So you've got to work that into the continuum, and then you've got to work the capacity end where you're training at a lower intensity than that two
Yeah.
minute per 800, and
With,
then
with
as
the
you get
reference
closer to
always being sports.
yes.
You're right.
Right, and so you don't want to. I mean, you don't want to deviate too far from where the competition is, but yeah, because and that ties into the transfer of training concept, where if people talk about like transfer and specificity, and a lot of times it gets, I think, people are overly zealous about it, where it's like if you're not doing the exact specific thing at the exact specific competition speed, and it looks like competition, then it doesn't transfer. But if you don't do things that deviate from what the game or the sport looks like, you're never going to build the extremes to kind of support those specific skills or biomotor abilities. So from like and I think transfer can be a very subjective term, and a lot of times everyone thinks they're doing it, otherwise they wouldn't be programming how they do. But I think it can be hard to prove. With your experience, like, do you think that we can quantify transfer in a satisfying way, or is it more about coaching instincts and heuristics and this really messy, subjective type endeavor?
I think in basketball, it's definitely a very messy endeavor, and it's one of the reasons that it's so important to be have a really good relationships with your player development and your assistant coaches that work on these skills with the players. Like you have to have a really seamless relationship with them, and you have to be on the same page when you're collaborating on, okay, what's like the terminal task that we're trying to get better at. Like a player is trying to learn how to cut in a certain way. maybe they need to get better going left, or they need to get better coming off of a screen at this specific angle, or maybe they need to accelerate or decelerate better in like a sport context. Like you need to be able to sit down with the coach, really isolate like what the movement looks like now and then what you need it to look like. And then there are, I mean, without getting too specific, like we try our best to come up with KPIs that we think represent that ability to either accelerate, decelerate, or change direction in a specific way. Like we try our best to do that, but there's a ton of gray area there, and I really do think a lot of times the best assessment is going to be the eye test and working with coaches who know whether that looks right or wrong. Um, and yeah, so I think that would be my answer for that one.
No, and I think where we see that a lot now is with the change of direction kind of agility debate. And I think a lot of times, like I think the pendulum is swung to everything needs to have this like cognitive component to it. But, to your point earlier, like if you're not capable of getting into a position or executing a cut at like a particular speed or intensity, even without like all these cognitive constraints, well, you're not all of a sudden like in competition when are those cognitive demands going to be able to hit those speeds and positions. So like you need to have those things available to you so that in competition you can self-organize in a way where like now the cognitive component is working in concert with the biomechanical. And I think a lot of times like we assume that like as coaches, we have to be really specific, but also players are like, and even in the NBA, like they're playing a lot of pickup, they're playing a lot of basketball. Like maybe sometimes from a transfer standpoint, I'm not saying it's always the case, but to me, it is conceivable that like you could do a change of direction drill without an opponent or without like a really high cognitive demand. And it might actually transfer to basketball better in some cases because they already have the pattern recognition from playing so much basketball, but maybe they don't have the mechanical or the force producing capabilities to access that in a game. And until you develop those capabilities, like maybe from the cognitive aspect is not the limiting factor. And again, we need KPIs to tease out like when it is cognitive versus when it's biomechanical. But I think that like with the change of direction pendulum, it's going to swing back to the middle where like there's a place for both. And I'm not saying all we should do is fix drills, but like, for you in the NBA, I mean, how much change of direction work are you doing and what kind of change of direction work are you doing off of what they're getting in small sided games and in practice?
Yeah, I mean, well, before we do a lot, I mean, honestly, with a lot of our guys, they lack, and if you look at like dynamic strength index type stuff where you're looking at like, okay, is this person more like, force oriented or speed oriented? Almost everybody, always tends to be a little bit more speed oriented unless you're working with like maybe like a big power forward or center. So I think the first thing is just really giving them the ability to really produce force, both like eccentrically on like a deceleration, or and then be able to create that stiffness, and then be able to accelerate from that. So, I think looking at those like three phases of we could call it a counter movement jump or a change direction, whatever. There's three phases to it, right? There's that eccentric, the amortization, and then there's the concentric component. It's like we are trying to break those down, make athletes more robust, more powerful, more force producing in those sequences, and then translating that to the court. So I mean, I'm assuming you could probably guess like the type of stuff that we're doing, but you know, resistance training.
Yeah.
Resistance training coupled with like, I'll be honest with you, I do like to get guys on the court, and I do like to get them moving and making cuts. And like a lot of the stuff Lee Taft puts out is phenomenal. And we've had, in Phoenix, I had Lee Taft in for a continuing education event for the staff, and learned a ton from Lee. So I suggest anyone who really wants to dive into the change direction stuff, Lee Taft, and actually resilience. You guys put out some good stuff there too.
Yeah. Trevor's done a really good job with that stuff.
Yeah, phenomenal. You guys did some breakdowns of it might have been Kyrie Irving, but you did some other breakdowns of defenders with like lateral running and like retreating and all this cool stuff. Like, so I recommend anyone out there check out some of that stuff.
Yeah. And then kind of going into, because some of the coaches that I respect the most in the NBA are doing a lot of their training even on machines. And,
Mhm.
it would have been like 10 years ago if you said like, I think training like on a leg extension machine or on a calf raise machine like has value or quote unquote transfers, like you'd be kicked out of the room. But I think a lot of times now, like you can make a case for it. Like if that's the weak link and that's like the part of that whole ecosystem that you're missing,
Yeah.
well, like maybe now like again, you have the cognitive part and the pattern recognition down, but maybe you can't absorb or produce the force. If you develop that in an isolated fashion on a machine, now maybe you can access it in the more complex skill with people around. So I think that the transfer thing is a cool conversation because I think there's a lot of really good coaches doing different things, and there's not like one absolute way or to kind of like to quantify it and define it. But I think it's good when coaches get together and just have these conversations because it can be very subjective. I think there's more than one way to do it.
I couldn't
Um,
agree more. 100%.
Now, what about injury prediction? I mean, I'm sure in your line of work where players in some cases are making $40 million a year, like we
Yeah.
all wish we could predict injuries. Do you think that's a fantasy or something that we should try to chase?
Oh man.
Like, do we even know what to look for and what to quantify? And assuming we can identify it, when we hold somebody out of a game because we said, hey, based on this KPI or measurement that we did, we don't think it's safe for you to play. Because I think that like until you're ready to do that, you're not really saying that you believe we can predict injuries.
Man, that is such a good question, and I'm I'm definitely I gotta admit, like, I don't know if I'm the right guy to answer that. Like, you know, I'm not very, every type of prediction, any prediction that I think would have any merit would have to be some type of machine learning based,
Yeah.
which I don't have enough expertise in to comment on. I do know that, and this is another reason it's hard for me to comment because I know some really really smart people, way smarter than I am, who think it's impossible. And then I know some really, really, really
Yeah.
smart people who say, no, this is doable. Like we can predict some stuff. So I'm gonna kind of play like the fence. I'm gonna be right on the fence for it. I don't
That's
know.
fair. Yeah.
Risk mitigation exists, and like anyone who's um, things have been predicted in other fields, and people have forecasted things in finance and in the market, and those people are good at, well, maybe some of them aren't good at predicting, which is what Nassim Taleb would say. But the I would say, like, I think it's still to be determined whether or not it can be. I don't know.
No, that's fair. And so maybe then between now and the next time that we talk, maybe I'm sure you'll go on YouTube and you'll learn about AI. But you brought up Taleb, and that's what it made me think of was like, well, I think when we try to be optimal, like even the acute to chronic workload stuff, it's like to me that concept like as a heuristic makes sense. I don't
100%.
know. I don't know if we can say with any degree of certainty that like if a ratio is at this absolute number, then someone is X or Y percent going to. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, but when we talk about like prediction, I think a lot of times just these heuristics or rules of thumb and like these kind of traditions probably work just as well as trying to be optimal. We'll see if the machine learning and the AI can take us there. I mean, I'm kind of like agnostic about it until there's proof that we can do it. But I do know that you do use force plates, and you've written some stuff about force plates. So what what kind of how do you use force plate data, and how does that influence your programming? Even if you're not trying to like optimally predict injury, I know that you're using it. So how does that inform your judgment?
Yeah, and like, well, I won't say they force plates. Obviously, I just what the answer I just gave you, like, I can't say they predict injury, but it is really cool to see where asymmetries lie with each athlete, and where they're placing a lot of their stress. Especially through the phases that we talked about, right? Like, um, on like the deceleration phase of a CMJ versus, like, force at zero velocity when they're kind of at the bottom, and then on the way up, and then on the landing. So if you're really breaking it down to those four phases, those are four phases where you can look at the asymmetries that are happening within the sequence, and you know where guys are pretty much biasing or not biasing. So I do think it informs us a lot there, and can sometimes explain some of the issues that they're having when they present on the table with some of my staff members. But um, So it informs you in that way, but then also, like I talked about earlier, with with how we yield into a jump, how we create stiffness at the bottom, and then how we take off. Like, those are three phases. I think from a performance standpoint, it can tell us a ton. Um, I think, I don't know where it was, but I listened to a podcast with Ty Terrell um, recently, who I'm a big fan of Ty and his knowledge when it comes to change direction and really agility work for basketball. He made the comment, like, you really, like, when you look at a change of direction effort, you really can't perform that change of direction unless you load first, right? You actually have to perform a counter movement before you have any leverage to push and to drive in any direction. So I think that yielding into the bottom of squat or into the bottom of like a counter movement is super important as an athletic ability. Being able to decelerate quickly, produce a lot of force and stiffness before you take off or push is super important. So when we're trying to make these changes with our athletes, you're chasing, you're chasing eccentric rate of force development, you're chasing force at zero velocity, peak force, impulse, all these things. And again, like, it'll help you explain, like, the issue with every athlete. And I'm not going to say issue, but like, maybe you're not trying to make the guy jump higher. Maybe you're trying to get him to jump faster.
Yeah.
And that's going to change the way that his force time curve looks. But it's a great way to track these changes and that you're trying to make with the athlete.
No, I think that makes sense, because a lot of times, like, people will say, "Oh, well, we can't predict injuries, therefore something like force plate data isn't useful." But that's not the only reason that you would use it. Like, injury prevention is only one, like, reason that you might use a piece of data. I think there's so many ways that can inform your training, and something that I think, like, Trevor's been experimenting with a little bit, and hopefully, we'll learn more about as well. So what about the book? Like, what was the impetus for writing that?
Man, so it all started out, and you and I talked off air about this, but I didn't go into it with the thought that I'm going to write a book about this system. And I think a lot of people have done this exact same route. Is I really wanted to just put my philosophy on paper. And through the years, like, I've been with 3 NBA teams up until this point, and like, I've used something that resembles this system kind of the whole time as I've been in the NBA. And it really started out because the sport of basketball and what the NBA is, you play 82 games in a regular season. That's a lot of travel. It's a lot of, you might have, between two games, you might have one day off, you might have 2 days off, or you might have 3 days off. So the microcycle pattern is always changing. So that affects your programming as a strength and conditioning coach. So you're trying to create a system that allows you to, and I mentioned this in the book, but have like a decision matrix of, okay, what that day looks like from a sports standpoint. And I always like to start with the sport and then work backwards from there. So, okay, what's happening in today's practice? Talk to the coaches about that. Is the intensity going to be high? If the answer is yes, that's going to put you on one side of the quadrant or one side of the plot. Is it going to be high volume? Is it going to be over 90 minutes? Whatever your threshold is. It is, okay, cool. So it's going to be high intensity and it's going to be high volume. That would put you in a quadrant 4. I know, based on my program, what I like to do with each athlete on a quadrant 4 day. So I've basically created a decision matrix that funnels me to the decision, and it reduces decision fatigue. So when you're going through this season, which is a grind, having a plan that it gives you some like substance, but then also some flexibility. I think that was like the whole purpose of the book, was to learn how to operate in chaos and consolidate stressors, kind of the way that I just talked about.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too deep into it, because I would encourage people to actually read the book. And I don't want to make this a substitute for the book, but what kind of my takeaway from it was, like you said, consolidating stressors, but also not just strength and conditioning, but like, how do you consolidate stressors when it comes to practice, games, training like motor abilities with like biomotor abilities, and not having this kind of like confounding effect. And even though you do it through the lens of basketball and the NBA, but I think this transcends basketball, and I'm sure that was your intention. Like, you can apply this quadrant system. Like, it made me think about, like, even being in the military. It's like, well, we do all this job specific training where we can somewhat quantify or categorize the stress, whether it's like parachuting, going to the range, doing medical training, or something that's a little bit more, like academic. And then even with like the physical training or strength and conditioning that we do to support those things, made me think of MMA. Like, how do you
Yeah.
marry and consolidate like your skills training with your striking, your grappling, your strength and conditioning with your tactics and transition. So I think you can apply this quadrant system to pretty much any kind of just performance oriented arena, probably even in like in business and some of those things too, because it's very intuitive, and you've taken these quadrants which are very simple to follow, and then there's some quadrants within the quadrants. And again, people might say, well, how do you know there's only four? It's like, it's a heuristic. It's like people get boxes, right? And then
Yeah.
that's what makes it cool. Like, I don't think you're saying that this is optimal. You're trying to find like what's good enough. Like, how can we just make this pretty simple and apply it in the real world? So that was kind of my takeaway. I mean, what do you want people's takeaway to be from it? Just because, again, I would encourage everybody to like actually read this and get into depth.
Yeah, that's a great question. I talk about it in kind of earlier in the introduction of the book, I believe, where I'm saying like this system isn't set in stone. I want people to be creative, and I want people to take their environments, and maybe, I talk about how I've used for if you're talking about the quadrants, you have two axes, right? So you have the X and the Y, and those axes tend to be for me like volume and intensity. And for volume, I've done everything under the sun, from like I've used distance, accelerations, player load, these things that come from the GPS unit. And then for intensity, I've done things like speed. I've done things like RPE. I've used everything you could possibly use, but I've kind of gotten to the point where I've whittled it down, and now I use basically time on feet as my volume metric, and then I use, did you play live today or did you not play live today? And that puts me in whatever quadrant I'm going to be in. I had to use my own experience to get to that point, but it's not necessarily what would work for someone in rugby or in football or hockey. And I want people to take the system and, use it as a springboard for your own environment, and you add to it and you change it and make it what you need for your purpose. So, because I mean, I would be an idiot to say like this has to be used in this way, or like you need to make strength what you do on a quadrant 4 day. Well, maybe your environment, power or speed, or maybe that's a rest day for like, maybe it's nothing. Like you figure it out. But what I do know is it helps. The quadrant is a great way to visualize for coaches. It's a great way to visualize for yourself and your staff, but also it helps funnel you towards a decision to make on a given day. And there's obviously a lot of factors that go into making the decision outside of the quadrant, but you can build that into your system too. And I talk about that in the book too, adding other factors and other dimensions to the decision making.
Yeah, and it really is just kind of a continuation of a more sophisticated version of the high-low model.
Mm-hmm.
And I can kind of see the influence from CrossFit there. I think it would be a great model actually to apply to CrossFit as well. But like when you were coaching competitive CrossFitters, like you have to categorize, and you can't just like say, okay, like we're going to work at a really high intensity on Monday, kind of do nothing on Tuesday, and then do high intensity. Like you have to kind of do something every day in a sport like CrossFit. So like, how do you quantify a gymnastics, exercise in terms of like intensity, and then how much volume do you apply so that you're not robbing yourself of recovery in between high intensity days? And I think that probably like working in that environment, I think even if it wasn't like conscious, made you better able to kind of like visualize it. And I think again, CrossFit, like people love to crap on it in our field, but like there are some CrossFit coaches doing some really cool stuff. And I think if you can program for high level CrossFit, programming for team sport is like not going to be that much different, not much of a jump.
Dude, people would have their minds blown if they talk to some of the coaches that are from the OPEX program, or people like James Fitzgerald, or just the high level CrossFit coaches are so knowledgeable and like so creative in their programming and their abilities to get people fitter. I think people in strength and conditioning in the team sport area, or even in just sport performance, could take a ton away from these CrossFit coaches, from these fitness.
And that was OPEC, you said?
OPEX, so it's OPEX,
Okay.
and they're based out in Scottsdale, Arizona. So, and they do a phenomenal job with what they do.
Yes, again, I would encourage everybody to buy and read the book, and then kind of wrapping it up here. What are some problems that like you or your colleagues or people in the field are trying to solve that you think are actually going to be solvable in the next couple of years? Like, what are the things that kind of keep you up where you're like, I think I can actually influence this, but we're a couple of years away, and how do we get there?
I think I selfishly, I'll speak from my own personal standpoint. Like, I think taking the sports science and taking the data and making it actionable, like all the stuff that we're doing from the force plate to the GPS to the accelerometer, all of those things, um, trying to find out like, okay, how do we take that, use it, make it actionable, and then see results with it? Because a lot of times, and I'm guilty of this. I've done it, when I first got in, like it's this big shiny toy, and front office, everyone values it, they think it's special, but it's like deep inside, you're like, man, I need to make sure this is carrying over to the sport. I got to make sure this is making these guys better, or am I trying to make it create the illusion that it is, right? And I think right now, I think throughout the landscape of a lot of team sport, at least in the United States, I think people are getting to that point where they're trying to use it and have it translate. That's where I am. And I think, kind of to piggyback off that, we talked about this earlier. I think the transfer training right now, there's so much cool stuff being done in the field. Um, from there's so many hybrids being created of really high level strength and conditioning coaches who are also really high level like sport coaches. And these hybrids, like for instance, Paul Fabritz, I don't know if you're familiar with Paul Fabritz's work with PGA Performance. Um, he puts out amazing material and amazing content on strength and conditioning for basketball. And he is a hooper. He can play really well, and he knows his stuff when it comes to exercise science. So these hybrids, I think they're kind of unlocking the keys to transfer. And I'm really interested to see where we're at in another 10 years.
That's cool. And then where can people, and we'll put these links in the notes, learn more about you? Where can they buy the book?
My website is athleteframework.com. So you can find the book there. And I'm on Instagram at Daniel Bove, and I'm also on Twitter at Daniel Bove. So feel free to follow me there. And been on the meme train lately. So I've been putting out a ton of memes on Instagram for the book. And that's actually become my new addiction. So if you want to check that out, go ahead.
Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate your time, and it's good catching up, and good luck with the season.
Doug, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it, man. Truly.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Resilient Performance Podcast. For 10% off our continuing education membership platform, please use promo code PODCAST at our website, resilientperformance.com, and be sure to join our mailing list for monthly exclusive content.